and a thin mist crept over the edges of the town's cobblestone streets. On this seemingly ordinary evening, a life would be shattered, a mystery born, and a chain of events would begin that would stretch for decades, leaving a mark on everyone involved. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe to the channel. Doing so helps us uncover more cases that have haunted communities for years. Cases where the truth finally emerges, no matter how long it takes. It started in October of 1987. The leaves had turned burnt orange and crimson, carpeting the town in a deceptive beauty that belied the darkness creeping beneath the surface. Sarah Whitmore, a 27-year-old schoolteacher, had just finished her evening shift at Ashbourne Elementary. She loved her students fiercely, often staying late to help with lessons or tutor struggling children. That evening, she had stayed behind to grade papers, her mind on the weekend trip she and her fiancé, Daniel, had been planning. Sarah left the school just after 8 p.m., locking the door behind her. The streets were empty, the cold air biting at her cheeks. She walked briskly to her car parked near the school's side lot, unaware that shadows followed her every step. A witness, an elderly janitor finishing up some maintenance, later recalled seeing a figure lurking near the playground. He had assumed it was one of the older students, perhaps staying late for a game of catch. He didn't notice the figure's movements were deliberate, controlled, almost predatory. By 8:30 p.m., Sarah never made it home. Her absence was noted by her fiancé the next morning, when she failed to answer his calls or appear for their planned breakfast. Panic set in quickly. Daniel rushed to the school, asking around, but no one had seen her leave. The janitor mentioned the shadow, but it was dismissed. After all, Ashbourne was a safe town, and late-night strolls were common among teachers. It wasn't until 9 o'clock a.m. that the first calls were made to the authorities. Detective Marcus Hall, a seasoned officer with over 15 years on the force, received the report. Hall had a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and an uncanny ability to read crime scenes like a book. Yet as he drove toward Ashbourne Elementary, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. Something about this case felt different. At the school, Hall spoke with staff and students. The pattern was clear. No one had seen Sarah leave, no one had heard a struggle, and the security cameras, old analog systems, showed only empty hallways. There were no fingerprints, no immediate signs of forced entry, and no obvious motive. Yet Hall noticed small details others overlooked. A paperclip on the floor near the classroom door, a faint scuff mark on the side of her car, and the subtle scent of something chemical in the air. The investigation moved quickly. Friends and family were interviewed. Daniel described Sarah as cautious, careful, and thoughtful. Someone who never took unnecessary risks. He was adamant that she would not have gone anywhere willingly without telling him. Detectives began to canvass the town, asking questions, following leads, and examining places Sarah had visited that week. Each lead ended in frustration. There were no witnesses, no confessions, and no immediate evidence pointing to a suspect. Days turned into weeks, and the town of Ashbourne was gripped by fear and speculation. Rumors ran rampant. Someone claimed to have seen a dark sedan near the school. Another insisted they heard muffled cries in the dead of night. Detective Hall refused to be swayed by hearsay. He focused on evidence, and yet, despite his dedication, the case remained unsolved. As weeks passed, the investigation stagnated. Sarah's disappearance became one of the cold cases that haunted the police department. Hall never stopped checking in, never let a lead slip away. But as the years went by, the trail grew cold, memories faded, and frustration mounted. The town carried on. Yet beneath the surface, the mystery of Sarah Whitmore's fate gnawed at everyone who remembered her bright smile and the kindness she carried wherever she went. Then came the breakthroughs in forensic science in the early 2000s. DNA technology, once a futuristic concept, had advanced to the point where evidence from decades-old cases could be revisited, analyzed, and potentially solved. Detective Hall, now retired, was called back in when a cold case unit was established in Ashbourne. The promise of new technology rekindled hope, and with it, the determination to finally uncover the truth. Among the small pile of evidence stored in the police archives, a vial of unidentified biological material, collected from the side of Sarah's car and never fully analyzed, was rediscovered. The sample had been preserved meticulously, labeled only as unknown tissue. Modern DNA profiling had advanced far beyond what anyone in 1987 could have imagined. A single drop could be enough to identify a suspect, even after decades. The lab work began cautiously. Swabs were taken, DNA extracted, and sequences analyzed. When the results returned, the lab technician nearly fell out of her chair. The genetic profile matched a known offender in the national database, someone with a history of violence, yet who had never been connected to Ashbourne. Detective Hall, now overseeing the case from the cold case unit, felt a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. The decades-long mystery was finally revealing its secrets. But the breakthrough was only the beginning. With the DNA match, Hall and the current investigation team began digging into the suspect's past, uncovering movements, patterns, and connections that had been invisible in the 1980s. Witnesses who had previously dismissed memories were re-interviewed. Old leads were re-examined in light of the new evidence. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to form. The suspect, a man named Leonard Hayes, had been living under the radar for decades. Hayes had been known to law enforcement circles for minor offenses, but nothing connected him directly to violent crime, until now. Investigators pieced together his movements, his proximity to Ashbourne in 1987, and his behavior patterns. Each new detail, corroborated with the DNA evidence, strengthened the case against him. As the investigation intensified, Detective Hall reflected on the journey. A case that had once seemed impossible to solve had transformed thanks to science and relentless persistence. Families who had despaired, communities that had lived in fear, and officers who had once been stumped were finally on the path to closure. Sarah Whitmore's story, though tragic, became a testament to the power of perseverance, technology, and the human commitment to uncover the truth. And as the case drew closer to resolution, the town of Ashbourne held its collective breath, ready to witness the moment when decades of mystery would finally yield to justice. The name Leonard Hayes echoed through the Ashbourne cold case unit like a haunting note. Younger officers barely recognized it at first, flipping through archival records as if they had unearthed some ghost from a forgotten era. But for the veteran detectives, and especially for Marcus Hall, the name carried weight, heavy, grim, and disturbingly familiar. Hall sat at the long, fluorescent-lit table, stacks of old documents laid out before him. Photographs, handwritten reports, yellowing witness statements, all part of a tapestry that had once painted nothing but frustration. The cold case room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. He stared at Hayes' record. Petty thefts, disorderly conduct, a bar fight, a few stints in county jail. Nothing about him on paper screamed violent predator. But Hall knew better than to trust paper. A criminal's record showed what they were caught doing, not what they were capable of. The younger detective assigned to assist him, Officer Elena Brooks, slid into the chair across from him. She was sharp, observant, ambitious, and always thinking 2 steps ahead. Ashbourne's department hadn't seen someone with her tenacity in years. "I've tracked down Hayes's last known address," Brooks said, flipping open a tablet. "A rural property about 40 minutes outside of Ashbourne. But he hasn't lived there in over a decade. Neighbors say he packed up and left without warning." "Did anyone notice anything unusual?" Hall asked without looking up. Brooks hesitated. One neighbor mentioned late-night visitors, men who arrived in old pickups, sometimes staying until dawn. They thought Hayes was buying stolen property. Hall nodded slowly. "It fits, sir." Brooks leaned forward. "You knew him, didn't you?" Hall didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a photograph buried under a stack of files. It showed a younger version of himself standing beside a patrol car, shoulder to shoulder with 2 other officers, and in the background, barely noticeable, was Hayes, arms crossed, eyes cold, watching. "He was never a suspect," Hall finally said, his voice low. "But he should have been." The memory tugged at him with surprising force. Back in the 80s, Hayes had been seen hanging around construction sites, diners, and the town outskirts, always drifting, always observing. A drifter in a town that didn't have drifters. Hall leaned back in his chair. "We interviewed him briefly after Sarah disappeared. He said he was just passing through, had no reason to stay." His jaw tightened. "We didn't have DNA then, didn't have the tech, just instincts." "And your instincts said that he was hiding something." Brooks exhaled, absorbing the weight of what this meant. If Hayes had been involved, he had slipped through their fingers, right under their noses. It was late afternoon when they visited the old rural property that once belonged to Hayes. The path was overgrown with tall grass, the fence falling apart, the house sagging under years of neglect. A place that felt frozen in time, abandoned, yet somehow still alive with memories. Hall walked through the remains carefully, scanning the dust-covered floors and the sun-faded wallpaper. He paused near the living room window, staring out at the lifeless yard. The place felt wrong, as if it had absorbed decades of decay and silence. "Sir," Brooks called from the hallway, "you should see this." She guided him into a small back room. Scattered across the floor were old newspapers, torn clothing, and empty beer bottles. Nothing unusual for a deserter's home. But on the far wall, half covered by debris, was a message carved into the wood. "Some things stay buried." Brooks swallowed. "Think he did this?" Hall stepped closer, running his fingers over the letters etched deep into the wood. Either him, or someone he didn't want finding something. "Do you think he knew the case would catch up to him someday?" Hall stared at the carving. "I think he believed he could outrun everything, including us." They spent hours searching the property and found nothing more than remnants of a life lived in the shadows. Still, something about the house lingered with Hall long after they left. A sense that Hayes had once waited there, watched there, maybe even brought someone there. As they drove away, Hall stared out the window, lost in thought. "A man like Hayes doesn't disappear without leaving crumbs," he murmured. "And we'll find them," Brooks replied confidently. Back at the station, the cold case team dove deeper into Hayes' background. His childhood was a story of instability, foster homes, juvenile detention, constant movement. No roots, no attachments. The perfect breeding ground for a man who could commit something monstrous and walk away as if nothing had happened. But the most chilling discovery came when Officer Brooks located an old employment record. In 1987, the year Sarah vanished, Hayes had worked for a construction crew contracted a short distance from Ashbourne Elementary School. His workplace was within walking distance of the school's side lot, the same lot where Sarah parked her car the night she disappeared. Hall stared at the record. Everything in his gut tightened. "He was right there," he whispered. "He was right there the whole time." The breakthrough ignited a new energy in the department. Officers dug into phone logs, bank records, travel documents, anything they could find. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of Hayes. He lived alone, moved often, worked temporary jobs, left towns suddenly, and every place he lived had a missing person case within a year of his arrival. Still, none of those cases had been connected to him. Not until now. At dusk, Hall returned home. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat heavily at the kitchen table. He was older now, his hands not as steady, his hair graying. But the fire in him, the need for justice, still burned fiercely. He pulled out the old case file on Sarah Whitmore. He studied her photograph, her smile frozen in time. "I won't fail you again," he whispered to the picture. The next morning, the lab called. Hall answered immediately. "We found something else," the technician said, excitement barely contained. "The DNA sample we analyzed wasn't just on the car. There were microscopic traces on the inside handle of her door." Hall's pulse quickened. "Meaning he touched it? Meaning he opened it?" Hall hung up, heart pounding. The evidence was stacking high and fast. For the first time in decades, they had momentum. He hurried to the station, where Brooks met him with a stack of new reports. "We also contacted Hayes's known associates," she said. "Most haven't heard from him in years, but one, an ex-girlfriend, mentioned something disturbing." "What did she say?" Brooks lowered her voice. "She said Hayes talked in his sleep, said he muttered things about a teacher, something about her crying, about a mistake he couldn't undo." Hall froze. When did she say this happened? In 1989. 2 years after Sarah disappeared. A heavy silence filled the room. "He knew," Brooks whispered. "He knew exactly what he did." Hall's voice hardened. "Then we're going to find him." The search intensified. They tracked down relatives, scoured digital footprints, examined every documented address. Then, a lead surfaced from an unexpected angle. Hayes had been spotted several times in a remote town 2 hours north. A local gas station attendant remembered him. Quiet, heavy-set, kept to himself, but always watching people with unsettling intensity. It was the first real sighting in over a decade. Hall, Brooks, and a small team set out immediately. As they drove, the tension in the car was electric. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky with streaks of red and gold. The roads narrowed as they approached the remote town, its isolation almost claustrophobic. Brooks checked her notes. The attendant said Hayes came in late evenings. Bought cigarettes, sometimes coffee. He hasn't been seen in a month. But that's more than we've had for years. Hall nodded. This might be the break we need. They arrived at the gas station, just before nightfall. The attendant, a wiry man in his early 40s, nodded nervously when shown Hayes' photograph. "That's him," he confirmed. "Guy creeped me out. Didn't talk much. Always looked like he was waiting for something." "Did he say where he lived?" Brooks asked. "No, but he always headed east after leaving here. I'd see his taillights disappearing down the old mountain road." The mountain road. Remote, quiet, easy to vanish on. The team followed the path under the cover of night. The air grew colder, the woods thicker. After 20 minutes, they spotted a faint flicker through the trees, a lantern light coming from a dilapidated cabin. Hall's breath hitched. Brooks whispered, "Sir, is that—" "It's him," Hall said, voice steady but tight with anticipation. "It has to be." They parked quietly and approached on foot, flashlights off. Hall felt every beat of his heart. This moment, the moment he'd waited decades for, felt surreal, unstable, electric. They reached the edge of the clearing, and there, sitting on the porch, was a man in his late 50s, hunched over, smoking a cigarette slowly, almost thoughtfully. His face weathered, his beard thick, his eyes dark and distant. Leonard Hayes. Hall stepped forward, flashlight clicking on. "Leonard Hayes," he called out. "We need to talk." Hayes didn't flinch, didn't panic. Instead, he exhaled smoke into the cold night air and smiled. Slow, chilling, resigned. "I figured you'd come eventually," he said. "Took you long enough." Hall felt a shiver crawl up his spine. This wasn't a man caught off guard. This was a man who had been waiting. Hayes didn't stand. He didn't run. He simply sat there on the edge of the rotting porch, cigarette ember glowing like a small red eye in the darkness. Detective Marcus Hall felt the icy weight of the moment sink into his bones. For decades, this man had been the shadow in the background, the name that meant nothing in the file, but everything in Hall's instincts. And now, here he was, alive, calm, almost welcoming. Officer Elena Brooks held her flashlight tightly, the beams steady, despite the cold cutting through her gloves. She watched Hayes carefully, noting the rigid posture, the stillness in his hands, the way he held his cigarette without the slightest tremor. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't afraid. He was prepared. Hall stepped closer. "Leonard Hayes, I need you to stand and come down with your hands visible." Hayes smirked, the corner of his lips twitching upward. "I'm not armed. Never liked guns. They make things messy." He flicked ash to the ground. "You can search me if you want." Brooks exchanged a glance with Hall. Something about Hayes's tone felt rehearsed, as if he'd practiced this moment over and over in his head. Hall approached slowly, eyes locked on Hayes's hands. "Then stand up." Hayes rose, joints cracking faintly in the quiet air. He lifted his arms slightly, not in surrender, but in a gesture that seemed almost mocking. Brooks moved in to cuff him, her movements firm and controlled. Hayes didn't resist. If anything, he seemed relieved when the cuffs clicked shut. "Good," Hayes muttered. "Finally." Brooks stiffened. "Finally what?" Hayes didn't answer. He simply stared out into the trees, as if seeing something no one else could. They escorted him to the SUV parked down the hill. Hayes walked with a slow, deliberate stride, like a man being led into a long-awaited fate. Once seated inside, he leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Hall studied him through the rearview mirror. "Leonard, you know why we're here." Hayes didn't open his eyes. "Sure, you found something. Something you can't ignore." His lips curled. "DNA, right?" Always figured that's what would do me in. Brooks's heart thudded in her chest. So you admit it? Hayes chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. I admit nothing, but I'm not stupid. He opened his eyes now, meeting Brooks's reflection in the window. Science always catches up. Hall clenched his jaw. Hayes wasn't fighting them. He was performing. Something about that terrified him more than if Hayes had run. When they arrived back at the station, Hayes was placed in an interview room. The walls were bare, the fluorescent lights harsh, the air heavy with anticipation. Hall stood outside the one-way glass, watching Hayes sit with the same eerie calmness he'd shown at the cabin. He's too relaxed, Brooks whispered. Most suspects panic. He's waiting. Hall nodded, because he knows part of the story, but not all. What do you mean? Hall lifted the DNA file. He thinks we only have one sample, but he doesn't know we found more. He doesn't know what else we discovered. Brooks inhaled sharply. So we use that. Hall looked at her. Exactly. They entered the room together. Hayes looked up slowly, as if waking from a dream, and grinned. Marcus Hall, he said with a strange warmth. Been a long time. Hall sat across from him, keeping his expression neutral. Too long. Brooks remained standing behind Hall. Hayes's eyes flicked to her briefly. So you brought backup, he smirked. Smart. She looked sharp. Brooks didn't react. Hall leaned forward. Leonard, you've been connected to the disappearance of Sarah Whitmore. Hayes leaned back, folding his cuffed hands in his lap. Sarah, he repeated softly, almost nostalgically. That name brings back memories. Brooks bristled. Care to share any of them? Hayes looked at her again, but this time, the smirk faded. Memories aren't always facts. You know how the mind works. He tapped his temple. Things get blurry. Time changes the truth. Hall's voice tightened. DNA doesn't. Hayes's smile returned. Ah, there it is, the silver bullet. Hall slid the photo of Sarah across the table. Hayes's eyes lingered on it. Not with recognition, not with remorse, but with something harder to read. Perhaps fascination. Page. She was a good person, Hall said quietly. Loved her students. Loved her family. Her fiancé never recovered after she vanished. Hayes shrugged slightly. Life breaks people. Brooks, fists clenched. Did you break her life? Hayes raised his eyebrows. Bold question. Brave. But no, not answering that, not yet. Hall kept his voice steady. Leonard, we know you were near the school the night she disappeared. So were dozens of people, Hayes replied. It was a public place. We know you touched her car, Hall said. Hayes blinked once, slowly. He tilted his head. Do you? Hall nodded. We have your DNA from the door handle. Hayes exhaled. But there was no shock. If anything, he looked entertained. You think that proves something? Brooks stepped forward. It puts you at the scene. Hayes laughed, a soft, hollow sound. Everyone touches cars. Parking lots are public. DNA can transfer, you know. Brooks' voice sharpened. Stop playing games. Hayes looked up sharply. His eyes, once dull, now gleamed with something dark. Oh, I love games. But I never play unless I know the rules. Hall placed another file on the table. Then let's play fair, because we have more, Leonard. Hayes's eyes flickered. Just a flicker, but Hall caught it. We found your DNA somewhere else, Hall continued. Hayes leaned forward now, curiosity sharpening his features. Where? Hall didn't answer. He didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, he allowed the silence to suffocate the room. Brooks felt the tension spike. Hayes's composure, the thing that had seemed unshakable, began to crack ever so slightly. "You're bluffing," Hayes murmured, but the confidence was gone from his voice. Hall remained silent, letting him stew, letting him imagine where else he might have left a trace. Hayes shifted in his chair. "If you had more, you'd say where." Hall finally spoke. "We're still processing everything." Hayes stared at him for a long moment. Then he sighed and leaned back. "You're trying to rattle me," Brooks said. Hayes' gaze snapped to her, and something cold passed over his features. "You weren't there in '87. You don't know what Ashbourne was like. Everyone watched everyone else. Everyone pretended to be perfect." His voice dropped. "But the cracks were always there." Brooks didn't blink. "Tell us about the cracks." Hayes smirked again, but weaker this time. "You wouldn't believe me." Paul leaned forward. "Try us." Hayes looked at Sarah's photo once more. This time a shadow crossed his face. Something like anger, or fear, or regret. "I didn't pick her," Hayes whispered. "I didn't choose her. It just happened." Brooks froze. Hall's pulse hammered. "Explain," Hall demanded. Hayes rubbed his wrists against the cuffs. "Life puts people in your path. Some stay, some vanish, some scream when you least expect it." Brooks's voice shook with controlled anger. "Sarah screamed?" Hayes didn't answer. He stared at his reflection in the metal table. Hall pressed. "Leonard, did you take her?" Hayes's eyes lifted. They glittered with something Hall had seen only a handful of times in his career. Not guilt, not sorrow, but defiance. "You think this is about one woman?" Hayes whispered. "You think this is about Sarah Whitmore?" Brooks' voice tightened. "Isn't it?" Hayes shook his head slowly. "Oh no, this story is much bigger than you think." The room fell silent. Hall felt his stomach drop. Brooks blinked. "What does that mean?" Hayes sat back with a weary sigh, as if preparing himself for something monumental. "You found one piece," he said, "but you're missing the others." Hall stiffened. "Others?" Hayes nodded. "I told you, things stay buried until someone digs them up." Brooks' skin chilled. "Are you confessing to more than one crime?" Hayes didn't speak. But the answer was already in his eyes. And for the first time since they'd found him, Detective Marcus Hall felt truly afraid. Detective Marcus Hall stayed in the conference room long after the others had filtered out. The evidence board stared back at him like a silent, accusing wall. Strings of red thread connecting old crime scene photos, faded mugshots, autopsy summaries, and forensic notes yellowed with age. It felt like a mausoleum of lost voices, a catalog of victims who had waited too long for justice. He pulled out a chair and sat, elbows on the table, fingertips pressed against his temples. The low hum of the building's air system filled the silence. Outside the window, dusk had already settled, brushing the sky with bruised colors. He reopened the case file. Emily Vargas, age 24. Last seen, October 12th, 1998. Found, October 19th. Cause of death, asphyxiation. DNA, inconclusive, degraded, insufficient for CODIS match. But now, they had something they hadn't before. A partial Y chromosome profile recovered from beneath Emily's fingernails. A miracle, really. Thanks to modern deep extraction techniques developed only in the last few years. But a miracle that gave them a problem. The DNA belonged to someone who shouldn't exist in the system. A ghost player. A genetic shadow. It matched no one in CODIS, but it echoed someone in the database. A familiar resonance. A trace, like the faint outline of a face in fog. a familial connection. To Grant Huxley, the deputy mayor. Marcus exhaled slowly. This case had just jumped from cold to volcanic. Just as he closed the file, the door creaked open, and Captain Dana Locke stepped back into the room, her expression unreadable. "You look like you're trying to resurrect the dead," she murmured. "Maybe I am," Marcus said. "Or maybe the dead are finally talking." Locke crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "You're not letting this go tonight, are you?" "No." He paused. "I can't." She pushed off the frame and walked closer, her voice lowering. "Marcus, you need sleep. And you need to remember, politics are a nightmare we cannot always fight. DNA doesn't lie because someone has a title," he answered. Locke's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Marcus looked back at Emily's photo, a young woman with soft brown hair, laughing in a candid snapshot from her college days. "She fought hard enough to scratch her killer," he said. "The least I can do is finish the fight for her." Locke sighed. "Then let's tread carefully. Whoever this mystery relative is, someone will try very hard to bury the truth again." Marcus looked at her. "Not if I get there first." The next morning, Marcus arrived early. Too early for most of the precinct. The sun had barely broken over the skyline, casting long shadows through the glass doors. He moved quickly down the hall, coffee in one hand, keys jangling. As he reached his office, he froze. The blinds on his window were slightly open. He rarely left them that way. He approached slowly, pushing the door open a few inches, scanning the interior. The room seemed untouched, nothing out of place, except the framed picture of his sister, Leah, which usually sat on the left corner of his desk, now rested on the right. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered. He stepped inside, heart rate climbing. He checked the drawers, all locked. He checked his files, nothing removed. But the picture? Someone had moved it deliberately. A message, a warning, a violation of space. He checked the door, no sign of forced entry. Whoever had been inside his office had used a key, or had access, or they wanted him to know they had been there. He picked up the frame, turning it over. There, taped to the back, was a small folded note. Marcus's breath hitched. He peeled the tape and unfolded the paper. The message was handwritten in neat, careful block letters. "Stop digging. He deserves to stay dead." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. His eyes darted to the window again, instinctively scanning the parking lot below. A dark figure, standing just outside the lot. Still, watching. Marcus blinked, and the figure stepped behind a car and disappeared. He rushed out of the office and down the hall, but when he reached the exit doors, the lot was empty, except for a few early employees' vehicles. No dark figure, no movement, just silence and cold morning air. Marcus clenched the note in his hand. Whoever was watching him knew he was close. They knew the investigation was reopening old wounds. They knew the dead were no longer silent. He walked back inside and headed straight to the lab. Dr. Tessa Marlin, the forensic DNA specialist, was already at her workstation. Petite, sharp-eyed, and methodical, she handled biological evidence the way a concert pianist handled a Steinway. Delicate, precise, reverent. "Morning," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Marcus," she replied without turning. "You're here early, again." "Couldn't sleep." "Same." She papped a few keys, pulling up a genetic map on the monitor. The blue strands glowed under the software's display. I ran another analysis on the Y profile. And she turned to him. It confirms a paternal line connection to Grant Huxley. But it's not Grant. The contributor is likely younger. How much younger? Potentially his son. Marcus frowned. He has a daughter, no son. Tessa hesitated. A sign he'd learned meant trouble. Not officially, she said, but genetically, yes. You're saying the deputy mayor has an unacknowledged son? I'm saying the DNA points that way. A close male relative. Very close. Marcus leaned against the counter. This was getting uglier by the second. Could it be a nephew? He asked. No. Too close. This is father-son proximity on the YSTR chain. Marcus rubbed his jaw. So the killer, or someone linked to the killer, is an illegitimate child of Grant Huxley? That's what the science says. And he's not in the system because he doesn't legally exist, Marcus muttered. Tessa nodded. Period. Marcus stared at the data, the glowing clusters and numbers representing decades of silence. Emily Vargas, he whispered. You didn't die for nothing. The lab door swung open suddenly, causing them both to jump. Captain Locke stepped inside, her expression tight. Marcus, we need to talk. He followed her into the hallway. What's wrong? She sighed heavily. Word of your inquiry into the Huxley family reached the mayor's office. Already? Marcus growled. I haven't even interviewed anyone yet. That's the point, Locke said. We're being warned off. Marcus narrowed his eyes. By who? Locke hesitated before answering. By the mayor himself. Marcus felt heat rush to his chest. They're trying to stop an investigation based on scientific evidence? On a possible serial killer? It's worse than that, Locke said softly. They're claiming reopening the case is a threat to public trust. That dredging up old accusations will destabilize the city. They're pushing for you to step away. Marcus froze. Step away? From Emily? From truth? Not possible. He shook his head. If they think intimidation is going to stop me? I know, Locke cut in, which is why I'm telling you this in private. Be careful, Marcus. They're not just trying to bury this case. She looked him dead in the eyes. They're trying to bury you. Marcus didn't return to his office right away. Instead, he stood in the quiet hallway outside the lab, the fluorescent lights humming faintly above him, the note still crumpled in his fist. Stop digging. He deserves to stay dead. He had faced threats before, gang retaliation, dangerous suspects, criminals with nothing left to lose, but this felt different. Calculated, personal, connected to someone with reach. Someone who could walk into a precinct undetected. Someone who could place a warning on his desk without leaving a trace. Someone who had a stake in making sure certain truths stayed buried. Marcus took a steadying breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked back toward his office. He needed to see if anything else had been disturbed. When he stepped inside, the room was silent, still infused with the faint scent of old paper and coffee. Nothing had been taken, papers undisturbed, files aligned. But the sensation lingered, a feeling that his office had been entered not just physically, but psychologically, like someone had reached in and rearranged the place where he kept his conviction. He placed the note on the desk, smoothing the creases slowly. A knock at the door jolted him. Detective Lena Morales leaned in, a folder tucked under her arm. Morning. You look like someone rewrote your obituary. Marcus forced a half smile. Just another day. She stepped inside, dropping the folder on his desk. I pulled some background on Emily Vargas's life from the archives. It's not much, The 90s were a mess in terms of digital record keeping, but I found something odd. He raised an eyebrow. Odd how? She'd been calling the same anonymous number repeatedly the week before she disappeared. No name attached, no address, burned metadata. Marcus's attention sharpened. How many calls? 7. All late at night. All under 2 minutes. Any recordings? Nothing. Phone company purged the logs 3 years after her death. He drummed his fingers on the desk. Why would she be calling an untraceable number? Unless she was in trouble. Morales nodded. That's my thought. And there's something else. She opened the folder and slid a faded photograph across the table. The image showed Emily standing in front of a university lecture hall, smiling at the camera. Her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. But behind her, half hidden, stood a man in a dark jacket. His head turned slightly away. You couldn't make out his face, but the posture, it was rigid. Watching. Is that? Marcus murmured. The same jacket style our Jane Doe victims described in the other 2 cold cases, Morales said. I checked. The stitching pattern is identical. Custom made. Late 90s biker cut. Rare as hell. Marcus leaned in closer. But her case predates the others by at least a year. Exactly. Emily may have been his first. Marcus's blood ran cold. He turned the photo over. The back was blank. No date, no note, no identifying marks. Can you enhance it? He asked. Morales nodded. Already asked tech. They're working on bringing out whatever they can. Marcus inhaled deeply. Good. We need everything. Morales hesitated. There's something else you need to see. She pulled up her phone and tapped a video. The screen lit up with grainy security footage. A timestamp ran along the bottom. 6:32 a.m. Today. Marcus squinted. It showed the precinct parking lot, empty at first. Then a tall figure dressed in dark clothing stepped into frame, stopping beside Marcus's assigned parking space. The figure turned toward the camera, face obscured by a hood. They slowly leaned down, did something under Marcus's car door handle, then walked away, disappearing behind a row of vehicles. Marcus's pulse ticked faster. You didn't see this? He asked. No. Came in while you were talking to Captain Locke. What did he put there? Morales shook her head. We checked. Nothing explosive, nothing toxic. She paused. But there was a second note. She reached into her pocket and handed Marcus a small sealed evidence bag. Inside was a slip of paper. He read it. You're looking in the wrong direction. The truth isn't where you think. Find the missing son. Marcus felt the room tilt slightly. His breath hitched. The killer wasn't running from them. He was leading them. Breadcrumbs, challenges, taunts. This guy, Morales murmured, he wants to be caught. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, he wants the game. Morales frowned. What do you mean? He wants control, Marcus said. He wants to guide us, to show us how smart he thinks he is. He wants the chase. And he wants us to know he's always a step ahead. Morales exhaled sharply. So what's our next move? Marcus stared at the note again. Find the missing son, and you find me. We track down every unacknowledged offspring connected to the Huxley family line, Marcus said, quietly, off the books. If this guy knows what the police are doing, we don't give him a trail to follow. Morales nodded. What about Captain Locke? Marcus hesitated. Not because he distrusted her, but because the circle of knowledge needed to be airtight. We loop her in, but not the higher-ups, not the mayor's office, not anyone tied to the Huxleys. And what about the threats? Morales asked. Looked at the note on his desk, then at the one in his hand. Let him threaten, Marcus said. Let him watch. Let him think he's steering me. A steely edge crept into his voice. I'll follow the trail, but on my terms. Later that afternoon, Marcus and Morales met with Captain Locke in her office. The blinds were closed, the door locked, and a white noise machine hummed softly in the corner. Locke listened silently as they explained the second note, the security footage, and the DNA revelations about an illegitimate son. She paced slowly behind her desk, tension radiating off her. Finally, she stopped and turned toward them. "This is no longer just an old murder," she said. "This is a live threat from someone who's been dormant for decades. Someone who believes he's untouchable." Marcus nodded. "He's tied to the Huxley bloodline, possibly Grant's illegitimate son." Locke tapped her finger against her chin. Grant Huxley would have been in his early 20s when Emily died, old enough to have a child no one knew about. Morales jumped in. "But if the killer is his son, then the motivation could be personal, targeting women who resembled someone in his past." Locke looked at Marcus. "You think Emily was targeted first because of something connected to her and Grant?" Marcus considered this. Maybe, but if Emily knew the killer, or if she knew Grant, that would explain the anonymous calls she made. She might have been trying to reach someone privately. Locke crossed her arms. What if Emily wasn't just a victim? What if she knew a secret? Silence hung heavy. Marcus pulled Emily's photo closer. Something made her scared. Scared enough to reach out to someone off the books. Someone who didn't want their identity traced. Locke paced again. "We need to talk to Grant." "No," Marcus said, "not yet. If he's involved, or covering something up, tipping him off would destroy everything." Morales nodded. "We investigate the potential son first. A hidden child leaves traces. School records, hospital visits, birth certificates, even sealed ones." Locke stopped pacing. "Then the three of us move forward. No one else. No leaks." Marcus agreed. "And we make one thing clear. Whoever left those notes, he wants a game." His eyes hardened. "But he's not the only one who can play." That night, Marcus returned home exhausted. He tossed his keys on the table and collapsed onto his couch. The weight of the day pressed hard on him. The revelations, the threats, the eyes watching him from the parking lot. He rubbed his eyes, exhaling heavily. But just as he leaned back, something caught his attention. A faint blinking red light, barely visible, coming from the bookshelf. Marcus stood immediately, moving cautiously toward it. He crouched down and scanned the shelf. There, wedged behind a row of old case binders, was a small device. A camera, active, recording. His throat went dry. Someone had been watching him, inside his home. For how long? He pulled the device out with a trembling hand. It was small, no bigger than a thumb drive, with no branding, no serial number. Professionally installed, and aimed perfectly at his desk, where he regularly reviewed case files. His pulse hammered in his temples. Then he noticed something else. Attached under the shelf, hidden in shadow, was a folded piece of paper. Marcus removed it slowly. His stomach twisted as he read it. "You're getting closer, Marcus. But so am I. Strong. End of P." Marcus felt the edges of the paper dig into his fingertips as he tightened his grip. The message was short, surgical, and terrifying in its precision. "You're getting closer, Marcus. But so am I." His home, the one place he believed was still untouched by this investigation, had been breached. Violated. Observed. His privacy peeled away layer by layer, leaving nothing but nerves and vulnerability behind. He scanned the room, instinctively, breathing deeply to steady himself. TV, bookshelf, desk, kitchen doorway, curtains. Nothing moved. No shadows. No sound. But the fear was real, tangible, thick as smoke. He pocketed the camera carefully, refusing to let a single fingerprint be smudged on it. He didn't know whether to feel more afraid that the killer had been inside, or more enraged that he had been toyed with. He reached for his phone and called Morales. She answered on the second ring. "Marcus, everything okay?" "No," he said quietly. "Someone broke into my home." "What? Are you there now?" "Yes. Are you safe?" "I think so." "What did they do?" Marcus hesitated. "They installed a camera." The silence on the other end was immediate, then sharp. "Jesus, Marcus." "And they left another note." "Stay where you are," she said. "I'm coming." "No," Marcus said quickly. "If someone's watching my home, they might notice two detectives meeting. I'll bring the device in tomorrow. I just needed you to know." Morales was quiet for several seconds. "Do you want me to call Locke?" "No, not yet. Let me sweep the place. Make sure nothing else is here. I'll text you once I'm done." "You sure?" He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Yeah." "Okay," she said reluctantly. "Be careful, Marcus. Don't underestimate him." "I won't." They disconnected. Marcus set his phone down and continued scanning the room. Slowly, methodically, every corner, every object, every possible blind spot. Years of detective work had honed his instincts into a finely tuned instrument. And right now, those instincts screamed at him to be cautious, controlled, and alert. After nearly half an hour, he found nothing else. But the dread didn't fade. He checked his locks twice, then sat at the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees. That's when he noticed it, a faint footprint near the window. Not from him, larger. Slightly smeared, as though the intruder had tried to wipe it but missed a spot. He crouched down and examined it closely. A work boot impression, heavy, distinct tread pattern, industrial grade. He photographed it from multiple angles. Then he realized something worse. The window's latch wasn't fully closed. It looked closed from a distance, but up close, he could see the slightest misalignment. The killer had slipped in through the window and had slipped out the same way. Quiet, efficient, trained. This wasn't someone improvising. This was someone with experience. Someone who understood how investigations worked and how to move through a space without leaving a trace. Marcus swallowed hard. He didn't sleep that night, not a minute. By morning, Marcus was at the precinct with dark circles under his eyes. His usual steady composure cracked just enough that Morales noticed the moment he walked in. "You look like hell," she whispered. "Feel worse," Marcus replied, placing the camera and the note on her desk. Morales examined the device carefully. "This is professional-grade surveillance equipment, not some amateur spy toy you buy online. Whoever installed this knows tech." "Any prints?" "I didn't touch a thing," Marcus said. "I used gloves." "Good." Locke's voice echoed behind them. "What's going on?" Marcus stiffened slightly. He turned to see Captain Locke approaching, her expression sharp and measuring. He gestured toward the camera and the bagged note. "They broke into my home," he said. "Left that behind." Froze for a moment. The air in the room became electric with tension. Then her expression hardened into something cold and fierce. "My office. Now." They entered Locke's small but commandingly tidy space, closing the blinds behind them. Locke locked the door, something she rarely did. She turned to Marcus. "Why didn't you call me last night?" "I handled it," Marcus answered. "No, you didn't," Locke snapped. "Handling it would have been calling backup. Handling it would have been protecting yourself. This killer isn't afraid to escalate. Marcus forced his voice steady. If he wanted to kill me, he could have. He had access. Locke ran a hand through her hair. That's what scares me. This isn't a threat of violence. This is dominance. He's inserting himself into your life, into your space, into your mind. Marcus looked down, silent. Locke softened, but only slightly. Marcus, you're too valuable to this investigation for him to break you mentally. And that's exactly what he's trying to do. Morales stepped forward. We're being steered. He wants us to chase the missing sun angle. He wants the game. Locke took a deep breath. Then we flip the board. She opened her laptop and pulled up internal files. I accessed sealed birth certificates related to the Huxley family. You'll want to see this. Marcus and Morales leaned closer as Locke clicked on a digitally archived document. A birth record appeared, heavily redacted, but with enough visible to draw immediate attention. Mother, unknown. Father, G. Hux, redacted thereafter. Gender, male. Status, sealed by court order. Marcus's pulse quickened. That's him, he whispered. This has to be the missing son. Morales nodded. Born a year before Emily was killed. Locke pulled up another record, a hospital intake form from 1999. Same child, age 2, admitted for minor injuries. Mother's name scribbled in faint pen beneath a redaction. Marcus squinted. Zoom in. Locke enhanced the image. The signature was faint, barely legible, but clear enough. Clara V. Morales gasped. Clara Vargas, Emily's older sister. Marcus felt his lungs seize. Emily's sister, he whispered. She took care of him. Locke nodded slowly. Looks like she raised him, off the grid, away from the Huxleys, probably to protect him. Morales stepped back as the implications hit her. So Emily knew. That's why she made those calls? That's why she died. Marcus closed his eyes. The killer wasn't just tied to the Huxley bloodline. He wasn't just some shadow stalking the outskirts of their investigation. He was part of Emily's life, part of her family's secret, raised by her own sister, a child hidden to protect him, and a man grown dangerous because of it. Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. Where is he now? Locke clicked again, pulling up a final document, an arrest report from 2010. Juvenile detention. Assault charges. Released at 18. After that, a blank. No employment record. No driver's license renewal. No tax filings. No address. No social footprint. It was as if he disappeared. Marcus stared at the empty section of the screen. He didn't disappear, he said quietly. He learned how to hide. Marcus stood frozen, staring at the blank expanse on Locke's screen. The absence of data felt louder than any confession. A man who left no trace in a world overflowing with digital fingerprints wasn't someone who drifted aimlessly. We can conclude that perspective. How to erase, how to observe without being observed. Morales broke the silence first, her voice low and uneasy. People don't just disappear from every government system at 18 unless they want to, or unless someone helps them. Locke nodded grimly. Or unless they were raised by someone who understood how to keep a secret. She closed the laptop with deliberate finality. Emily's sister, Clara. She had to have known something. A hidden child doesn't keep itself hidden. Marcus swallowed hard. Clara left Brookview entirely after Emily's death. Moved out of state. Disconnected. Avoided interviews. He pressed a hand to his jaw. We always assumed grief, trauma. But maybe she was protecting him. Morales paced, tension radiating from her. Protecting her sister's son, or hiding him because she feared what he could become. Marcus exhaled slowly. Maybe both. Locke pulled out her phone. I'm ordering a quiet search for Clara Vargas's last known address. No digital footprints since 2002. But maybe we can locate property records, utility connections, anything. You think she might still be alive? Morales asked. I think, Locke replied, that if she's not, the son might have been alone for the first time in his life, and that could trigger something. Marcus's chest tightened. A pattern, a timeline, a reawakening. He thought of the camera hidden in his home. The notes, the shadow in the parking lot, the precise knowledge of police protocol. This wasn't random. This was a man raised in secrecy, shaped by abandonment, sharpened by survival. A ghost carved from a lie. Marcus forced himself to stay grounded. While we search for Clara, I'll go back through Emily's old acquaintances, friends, classmates, anyone who might remember seeing someone around her during the months before she died. All right, Locke said. Divide and conquer. And Marcus, he paused at the door. Until we know more, Locke said sternly, you're not staying alone. Not after last night. I can handle myself. No, she said sharply. Not when you have a target on your back, drawn by someone who's been watching you long before you realized it. Morales stepped beside Marcus. I'll stay at his place tonight. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Locke cut him off. This is an order. Not a suggestion. And Marcus nodded reluctantly. Fine. As he and Morales left the office, Locke sat back down heavily, rubbing her temples. The stakes had changed. The game had changed. And the killer had made it deeply, dangerously personal. During the afternoon, Marcus and Morales split up. Marcus visited Brookview University, where Emily had studied journalism. The campus was quieter now than the photo from the 90s. More modern buildings, new benches, updated walkways. But memories lingered in the architecture like ghosts, unwilling to leave. The building Emily once studied in still stood, Harper Hall. Ivy clung to its stone walls, and students drifted in and out between classes. Marcus walked inside, the smell of chalk and old books tugging at something deep and reflective. At the front desk, an elderly receptionist looked up from her crossword. Help you with something, detective? Marcus flashed his badge. Marcus Hall, I'm looking into a former student. Emily Vargas. The woman's face softened. Oh, Emily. I remember her. Bright, sweet girl. Terrible thing that happened. Marcus nodded. I'm hoping to find someone who may have been close to her. A mentor, maybe. Someone she trusted. The woman pointed down the hall. Professor Dorian Reeves, room 205. He's retired, but he still volunteers here for guest lectures. He was fond of Emily. Marcus thanked her and made his way upstairs. He knocked on 205, and a warm, slightly gravelly voice responded. Come in. Inside, Marcus found a tall, thin man with silver hair pulled into a small ponytail. Books stacked in precarious towers filled the room. Reeves looked up from a pile of papers. Yes? Marcus stepped forward. Detective Hall, I'm investigating the murder of Emily Vargas. Reeves blinked slowly, then removed his glasses. I've waited years to hear that someone was reopening her case. His voice trembled softly. Sit, please. Marcus sat. Professor, I need to ask, was there anyone Emily spoke about often? Someone who concerned her? Someone she feared? Reeves inhaled, and his eyes clouded with memory. Emily was troubled those last few months, distracted. She'd often step out abruptly during class to take phone calls, claimed they were from her sister, but she seemed restless, nervous. Marcus's pulse quickened. "Do you recall any details?" Reeves nodded. "One day, after class, she asked if we could speak privately." He closed his eyes. "She told me she'd uncovered something that could destroy people who didn't deserve power. Something she didn't know how to handle." Marcus felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Did she say who?" "No, but she said, 'I shouldn't have gotten involved. It's too late now.'" Reeves opened his eyes. "I begged her to go to the police. She said she would after talking to someone first." Marcus's breath hitched. The anonymous number. The calls. "Professor, did Emily ever mention someone watching her?" Reeves's face turned pale. "Yes, she thought she saw a man outside her dorm, followed her between classes, stood near her bus stop." He paused. "When she described him, it reminded me of someone I'd seen on campus once or twice." "Why didn't you tell police?" "I did," Reeves said softly. "But no one ever followed up." Marcus clenched his jaw. "What did the man look like?" Reeves swallowed. He wore a dark jacket, kept his head down, never spoke. But Emily said he felt familiar. Familiar. Marcus realized immediately what that meant. "Did she ever say he looked like someone she knew?" He pressed. Reeves nodded. "She said he reminded her of her sister somehow, but she didn't understand why." Marcus's heart dropped. The killer wasn't just related to the Huxleys. He was connected to Emily's bloodline too, through Clara. Emily had been followed by her own nephew, a boy she may not have known existed. Marcus sank deeper into the chair. "Professor, if you had to guess, how old did this man seem?" Reeves thought deeply. "Young, maybe late teens or early 20s. Marcus whispered, "My God." The timeline aligned too perfectly. The killer had started watching Emily as a teenager, drawn by something he didn't understand, drawn by blood, drawn by the secrecy surrounding his birth. He had found her. He had followed her. And when she tried to expose the truth, he silenced her. Marcus stood suddenly. "Professor Reeves, thank you. You've been incredibly helpful." Reeves placed a hand on Marcus's arm. "Detective, be careful. Whoever did this, Emily said he was relentless." Marcus nodded. "I know." He walked out, heart thundering, mind racing with connections he wished he never had to make. Emily never stood a chance. And now, neither did Marcus. As Marcus left the university, his phone buzzed. A text from Morales. "Clara Vargas. Found an old address. Rural cabin. About 40 minutes outside the city. We should go tonight." "But Marcus, there's one more thing. The property is listed under a fake name connected to a private trust. Guess whose trust?" Marcus stared at the screen, dread filling him. "G. Huxley." Before he could respond, another message came through. A different sender. A hidden number. "Did you like the new view from your bookshelf? Tonight, you'll learn what Emily learned. The truth. Come alone, or someone else dies." Marcus's blood ran ice cold. The killer wasn't done playing. He was just getting started. Detective Marcus Hall stood completely still, his breath barely leaving his lungs as he stared at the spot where the figure had just disappeared into the fog. The cold air pressed into his skin, yet the world around him felt strangely silent, as if even the night was holding its breath. Moments like this always unsettled him, not because of fear, but because he had learned over decades in law enforcement that shadows rarely moved without reason. And when they did, they usually belonged to someone with a purpose. He moved slowly toward the edge of the property, eyes scanning the perimeter, senses sharpened. The old fencing behind the evidence facility creaked softly in the wind. A loose piece of chain link shifted, as though someone had brushed against it moments earlier. Marcus crouched, running his gloved fingers along the metal. It was still vibrating faintly. Whoever had stood there had moved fast, very fast. His phone buzzed. A message from the forensics lab. Results ready. Marcus exhaled, the breath puffing visibly into the air. He stood, taking another long look toward the darkness, then turned toward his car. The figure could wait. The DNA couldn't. Inside the vehicle, the heater hummed faintly as Marcus tapped the steering wheel in thought. He had spent the last several days juggling an impossible puzzle. Old case files, new doubts, the resurfacing of a long-buried sample that shouldn't have existed. And now, a shadow watching him from a distance. Cold cases didn't usually come with live observers. The lab was a short drive from the precinct, but Marcus felt every second of it. When he finally stepped into the brightly lit corridor, a sharp contrast to the darkness he had just left, he spotted Dr. Lena Morayo waiting near her office doorway. Lena was precise, brilliant, and unflinchingly honest, traits Marcus valued more than he ever voiced aloud. She raised a brow. "You look like you saw a ghost." "Maybe I did," Marcus muttered. "Tell me you've got something." Lena didn't smile, but the seriousness in her eyes shifted, just slightly. She gestured for him to follow her inside. The soft hum of machines filled the room, blue lights blinking on sample analyzers. A folder sat at the center of her desk. Sealed. "It's been almost 30 years since the Markham case first crossed your desk," she said quietly, sliding the folder toward him. "But this changes everything." Marcus didn't open it immediately. He swallowed, thumb resting on the edge of the folder. "Is it who we thought?" "That's the thing," Lena said. "You always suspected the killer was someone close, but the DNA doesn't match any of the original suspects. Not the ex-boyfriend, not the coworker, not the neighbor, none of them." Marcus froze. "Then who does it match?" Lena hesitated, a rare thing for her. She reached for another sheet of paper and placed it beside the folder. A set of numbers, names, and genealogical markers filled the page. Marcus blinked. "No, that can't be." "It's a familial match," she explained gently. "Very close. Enough to narrow it down to a single bloodline." He felt his chest tighten. The room seemed to tilt, even though he hadn't moved. Lena continued, "Detective, the killer wasn't one of your suspects, but someone connected to one of them. Someone whose DNA would only show up if you ran extended family comparisons, which, back in 1996, wasn't even possible." Marcus opened the folder at last. The name on the page hit him like a physical strike. "No way," he whispered. "He was a kid. He couldn't have." Lena nodded grimly. "People grow up, Marcus. People change." The fluorescent lights above them hummed softly, filling the silence. "According to the match," she said, tapping the sheet, "this DNA belongs to someone directly related to your original primary witness." Marcus's mind raced back. Long nights, taped interviews, the shaky voice of a teenager insisting he'd seen nothing, heard nothing. A kid who lived 2 houses down from the victim. A kid who had cried during questioning. A kid Marcus had once felt sorry for. Adrian Vale, Marcus breathed. The witness, his younger brother, Caleb. He looked up slowly. Are you telling me Caleb Vale is our killer? Lena didn't answer immediately. The DNA suggests a near-perfect match. And one more thing, Caleb's DNA profile is already in the system. He was processed last year in a bar assault, though the charges were dropped. The implications hit Marcus like cold water. Caleb Vale, no longer a frightened boy hiding behind his older brother. Now a grown man with a criminal record, a temper, and, according to the DNA, the man responsible for a murder that had haunted the town for nearly 3 decades. Marcus closed the folder. Where is he now? Lena hesitated. I checked before calling you. According to employment records, he works for a private security contracting firm. Armed? Marcus asked. Likely. Marcus inhaled, slow and heavy. He knew I reopened the case. That shadow, outside the evidence facility tonight, that wasn't random. He shook his head. He's watching. He's scared. Or worse, he's planning something. He stood and slid the folder under his arm. Marcus, Lena said quietly, be careful. If he's willing to kill once, he'll do it again, Marcus finished. He left the lab with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Not relief, no. Something closer to dread, wrapped in determination. The Vale family. How had he missed it? How had everyone, detectives, prosecutors, forensic teams, overlooked the most dangerous person in the household all those years ago? Outside, the wind swept through the parking lot again, colder than before. Marcus scanned the shadows instinctively. No movement, no figure watching this time. Or maybe the figure knew better now. He got into his car, pulled out of the lot, and headed straight toward the one place he knew he needed to go next. The Vale residence. Not to confront anyone, not yet. But to walk past old ghosts, retrace old steps, and answer the questions that had been buried for too long. Because now, the case was no longer cold. It was burning. And DNA had spoken. The drive to the Vale residence felt longer than it used to. Even though Marcus had made the trip countless times in the past. Back then, it had been a neighborhood filled with children riding bicycles, porch lights glowing warmly, and the easy rhythm of suburban life. Now, decades later, the street looked tired, older, dimmer, worn down by time, the same way the truth had been. Marcus slowed his car as he approached the familiar house. The wooden siding had faded to a dull gray, and the once vibrant garden Adrian's mother had tended now lay swallowed by weeds. The porch railing sagged slightly, and one of the windows was boarded up. A home that had witnessed far too much pain and far too many secrets. He parked across the street, letting the engine idle as he watched the quiet structure. The Vale brothers had grown up here. Adrian, the responsible older one, always keeping watch over his younger sibling. Caleb, the quiet, restless type. Marcus remembered interviewing them after the murder. Adrian had spoken clearly, trying to help. Caleb, barely 14 at the time, had barely said a word. Marcus stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the sidewalk, crunching dead leaves under his boots. As he reached the curb, he saw a flicker of movement, just a curtain shifting inside the house. Someone was there. He didn't approach the door. He didn't need to, not tonight. Instead, he walked the perimeter, letting memory guide him. He could still picture the police tape, the flashing red and blue lights, the officers combing the neighborhood. He remembered standing on this very same sidewalk 29 years ago, looking at a young Caleb Vale sitting on the porch steps, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes wide and hollow. Back then, Marcus had believed those eyes reflected trauma, fear, and the shock of a violent crime occurring so close to his home. Now, he wondered whether those hollow eyes had concealed something far darker. As he stood there, a car turned slowly onto the street. Marcus's muscles tensed instinctively. The vehicle rolled toward him, headlights briefly washing over him before pulling into the driveway of a house 2 lots down. Just a neighbor, nothing more. But his nerves didn't ease. He glanced back toward the window. The curtain was now perfectly still. Marcus turned and walked back to his car. He slid inside, locked the doors, and rested his hands on the steering wheel. He wasn't here to engage, not until he had backup, and not until he fully understood just how far Caleb Vale had gone to hide his past. He drove off slowly, the Vale house disappearing behind him in the rearview mirror. The weight of old memories sank deep into his chest. 20 minutes later, Marcus returned to the precinct. It was nearly midnight, but the building hummed with life as usual. He walked past officers, past ringing phones, straight to his desk. He pulled out the old case files, the original crime scene photos, police statements, neighborhood interviews. He scanned Caleb's original file. A single page, barely a paragraph. The teenage boy had said he'd been home the night of the murder, asleep until his brother shook him awake. No alibi. No witness confirming his whereabouts. Just a scared kid's word, untested, unquestioned. Marcus opened a different folder. The autopsy. Julia Markham, 22 years old, college student. Bright, ambitious, with a future that had been brutally taken from her. Her body had been discovered in the woods behind the old railway station. The attack had been shockingly violent, suggesting rage beyond comprehension. Their main suspect back then had been a man with a known history of aggression, someone who'd lived only a few blocks from Julia. But not enough evidence had ever stuck. And now, decades later, the DNA on Julia's clothing pointed not to that man, but to Caleb Vale. Marcus rubbed his temples. The truth had been buried so deeply that it had taken nearly 3 decades of scientific advancement just to find the tiniest thread of it. His phone buzzed, jolting him. The caller ID flashed. Chief Rourke. Marcus sighed before answering. "Yeah, Chief. I heard you visited the lab tonight," Rourke said, his voice gravelly from years of late nights and stronger coffee. "Murillo sent me the preliminary findings." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Then you know." "Yeah," Rourke said. Then after a moment, "We missed him. All these years, and he was right under our noses." "We had blind spots," Marcus replied quietly. "We focused on men with records, men with motives. But sometimes the real monster is the one pretending to be invisible." There was silence on the line. Then Rourke's voice lowered. "Hall, Murillo also told me someone was watching you tonight." Marcus hesitated. "Yeah, someone was there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. You think it was him?" "Instinct says yes," Marcus said. "He knows we're closing in. He knows the DNA puts him right at the scene." "Then he might run." "No," Marcus said. "Caleb doesn't strike me as the type who runs. He watches, he plans, he's calculating." "And dangerous," the chief added. Marcus nodded. "Very." Rourke exhaled heavily. All right. First thing tomorrow, we're pulling his full employment records, associates, travel history. If he has weapons permits, if he's taken tactical courses, I want it all. I'm ahead of you, Marcus said, tapping his keyboard. Already looking into it. And Marcus, the chief said, voice softer now, almost fatherly. Don't go after him alone. Marcus managed a thin smile. I know, I'm not 25 anymore. Wish you were, Rourke muttered. Would make this damn job easier. They hung up. Marcus leaned forward again, the glow of the computer screen reflecting in his tired eyes. He typed in Caleb Vale's name and hit enter. The file that opened made his stomach tighten. Caleb had indeed taken tactical training, firearm courses, survival workshops, close combat classes. Some through his employer, some privately. This wasn't a restless teenager anymore. This was a man who had spent years preparing. For what? Marcus clicked deeper. Employment details, addresses, emergency contacts. That's when he froze. A red marker flashed beside Caleb's current assignment. Marcus leaned closer. Location: Eastbrook Security Storage Facility, Evidence Storage Division. Marcus's pulse quickened. Evidence storage. The same facility where Marcus had seen the silhouette earlier. The same facility where old case boxes, including the Markham case, were kept. Suddenly, everything aligned into a chilling possibility. Caleb hadn't just been watching. He had access. He had motive, and he had every reason to destroy the very evidence that could put him away forever. Marcus stood so fast, his chair slid back. He grabbed his keys, threw on his coat, and headed for the exit. Every second counted now. Because if Caleb Vale knew the DNA had spoken, he wouldn't stay quiet for long. Marcus pushed through the precinct doors and into the cold night air with a force he didn't entirely register. His breaths came hard, visible in the dark, as he strode toward his car with a single relentless focus: the evidence facility. If Caleb was there, if he was already inside, then every second Marcus wasted was another second the past could be erased forever. He unlocked the car, slid inside, and turned the engine over. The headlights cut through the darkness as he accelerated down the street. Each block felt like a countdown. The city was quiet at this hour, streetlights glowing dimly, storefronts shuttered and still. Marcus's hands tightened around the wheel as the familiar dread curled into his stomach. He knew what a cornered man was capable of. He knew what someone like Caleb, trained, angry, desperate, could do when confronted with the truth he had buried for decades. As he approached the evidence facility, the building stood silent against the night sky. It wasn't large, but it was heavily secured. Cameras, reinforced doors, layered access controls. No one should have been able to enter without clearance. No one except the staff on Caleb's security roster. His name, his clearance level, his rotations, all of it flashed urgently through Marcus's mind. He pulled into the empty lot and killed the engine. The cold wind hit him immediately as he stepped out, tugging at his coat, pulling at his collar like invisible fingers urging him to reconsider. Marcus looked up at the building. The motion sensor lights flicked on, washing the concrete walk and security entrance in harsh white. Too quiet. He moved cautiously, not drawing his weapon yet, but letting his hand rest near it. As he approached the entrance, he noticed something off. The keypad light showed faint smudges of fresh oil. Someone had used it recently. Very recently. Marcus whispered under his breath. Damn it. He pulled his badge, and swiped it against the secondary control panel. The lock clicked open, but the metallic sound echoed far too loudly inside the silent night. He stepped in, aware of every faint noise, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant buzz of ventilation units, the subtle creak of the building shifting in the cold. He closed the door gently behind him, then moved down the long corridor lined with steel doors and storage units. Rows of lockers held evidence ranging from petty theft cases to major felonies. But the older cases, the ones that had shaped the town's darkest histories, were stored deeper inside, in climate-controlled rooms that required dual authorization. Marcus walked past the front desk, instinctively glancing at the monitor screens. One feed caught his eye immediately. Camera 7, the archive hallway. The light in that hall wasn't supposed to be on. Marcus froze. There, just at the edge of the frame, was movement. A shadow, not full-bodied, but unmistakable. Someone else was inside. He didn't need anyone to tell him who. Marcus drew his weapon, flicked the safety off, and began moving down the hall. His footsteps were soft but deliberate, echoing faintly off the polished floor. His heart pounded loudly enough that he wondered if whoever was ahead could hear it too. Halfway down the corridor, something else caught his attention. A faint, rhythmic scratching sound, like a key turning or a lock being tampered with. Marcus's lips tightened. Julia Markham's evidence box was stored in the deepest section. If Caleb was here to destroy it, he'd go straight for it, and the door to that section was supposed to remain locked at all times. Marcus rounded a corner, and the scratching grew louder. Another corner, and the hallway narrowed. The last room stood at the far end, thick, reinforced, with a glowing red reader panel. And hunched beside it, his back turned, was a man, Caleb Vale. Even after nearly 3 decades, Marcus recognized the slope of the shoulders, the rigid posture, the tension coiled like wire beneath the skin. Caleb was older now, mid-40s, taller, broader, but there was something unmistakably familiar about him. Caleb worked silently, a small device connected to the keypad. He didn't even glance over his shoulder. Too confident, too calm. Marcus stepped forward. Vale. The man froze. Slowly, Caleb turned his head. Not fully, just enough for Marcus to see the edge of his jaw, the shadow of his cheekbone. His eyes glinted under the fluorescent lights. "Detective Hall," Caleb said softly. "You always did show up at the worst possible time." Marcus kept his gun steady. Step away from the door. Caleb let out a breathy chuckle. "You think I'm here to hurt you? You're here to destroy the past." Caleb turned fully now, hands raised slightly, not fully surrendering, but not reaching for anything either. He looked calm. Too calm. "You dug up something that should have stayed buried," Caleb said. "Something that doesn't help anyone. Doesn't help you," Marcus corrected sharply. Caleb tilted his head. "You think you know me. I know your DNA was found on Julia Markham's clothing." Something flickered in Caleb's expression, something sharp, something violent, before sliding behind a calm mask. "DNA," Caleb repeated. "Funny how a few molecules can ruin a man's life." "It didn't ruin your life," Marcus said. "You ruined hers." A silence fell between them, heavy, suffocating. Then Caleb smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't human. It was the smile of someone who felt untouchable. "You don't understand what happened," Caleb said quietly. "You think you have the whole picture because of a lab report. But you don't know anything about that night. I know enough, Marcus said, and I know you're not walking out of this building without answering for it. Caleb lowered his hands slowly. Then you're making a mistake. Marcus steadied himself. Move away from the door. Now. Caleb's eyes shifted, not to Marcus, but to something behind him. Something Marcus couldn't see. Instinct screamed. Marcus spun around, but he wasn't fast enough. A form lunged out of the shadows. A heavy weight crashed into him. The impact knocked the breath out of his lungs as he hit the ground. His weapon skidded across the floor, sliding into the darkness. Marcus grunted, rolling as the attacker pinned him down. A gloved hand struck him across the jaw, sending a burst of light into his vision. Marcus fought back, elbowing hard into the attacker's ribs, twisting his body enough to break the hold. He shoved the man off and scrambled to his feet. But Caleb was already gone. Marcus's heart pounded with a brutal realization. Caleb didn't come alone. He had help, and he was already deeper inside the facility. Marcus turned toward the secure evidence room. The lock light was green. The door was slightly open. Caleb had gotten inside. And the past, the truth, the only proof of what happened to Julia Markham, was seconds away from being erased forever. Marcus lunged forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in his jaw and ribs as he shoved the evidence room door open with his shoulder. The heavy metal swung inward with a low groan, and he stepped into a cold, dimly lit chamber, lined from wall to wall with shelving, steel drawers, and rows of sealed boxes. Thousands of pieces of history waiting silently in the dark. But right now, none of them mattered except one. Julia Markham's box. And Caleb Vale stood only a few feet from it. Caleb had already found the shelf. Marcus could see the small rectangular container in his hands. The pale fluorescent light cast sharp shadows across Caleb's face as he held the box like something poisonous. His expression, unreadable at first glance, twisted with a mixture of anger, bitterness, and something unexpectedly hollow. "Put it down, Caleb," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline running through him. Caleb didn't turn fully. He just looked at the box, fingers tightening until the plastic creaked under the pressure. "You spent 30 years chasing the wrong ghosts," Caleb said softly. "And now you think this is the answer?" "It is the answer," Marcus replied. "DNA doesn't lie." Caleb finally looked up. His eyes, dark, glassy, flickering with something dangerous, locked onto Marcus's. "People lie," Caleb murmured. "Memory lies. Fear lies. But DNA? DNA is just a tool. It doesn't know the truth. It doesn't understand the night Julia died." Marcus moved closer, careful, slow. "Then why run? Why break in? Why erase the evidence if you're innocent?" Caleb laughed quietly, an unsettling, humorless sound. "Because innocence means nothing when the world decides you're guilty." He lifted the box slightly, almost as if he were weighing it. "You don't know what I lived through," Caleb continued. "You don't know what happened in that house, what my brother made me cover up, what he made me do." Marcus's muscles tensed. He did not lower his guard. "Your brother?" Caleb gave a small, cold nod. "Adrian." His eyes flicked downward. He wasn't the saint everyone thought he was. Marcus shook his head slowly. "The DNA matches you, Caleb, not Adrian." Caleb's expression sharpened. "Of course it does. I was there. But you never asked why. You never asked what he made me do." Marcus took a step closer. Then tell me. Caleb's lips pressed into a thin line. He set the box down gently on a metal table beside him, not relinquishing it, but releasing enough to keep his hand free. His breathing became shallow, controlled, like a man steadying himself before reopening a wound he'd kept sutured for half a lifetime. I was 14, he said. 14. And Adrian, he was losing control. Caleb's voice shook, barely, but enough for Marcus to catch it. He drank, he raged. He blamed me for everything. For Mom leaving. For Dad working double shifts. For his failed classes. For his pathetic life. Marcus felt a chill slip down his spine. He remembered Adrian Vale well. Quiet, responsible, polite. Never a mark on his record. Never a sign. But Marcus had also learned in his many years on the job that the most dangerous people rarely looked dangerous. Caleb continued. Adrian knew Julia. They worked together part-time. She was kind to him once, and in his twisted head, that meant something else. When she turned him down, when she started seeing someone else, something broke in him. Caleb swallowed, the memory scraping raw against his throat. That night, he came home covered in blood. He threw clothes at me, told me to burn them, told me to swear I didn't see anything, told me to lie to the cops, told me he'd kill me if I didn't. Marcus's stomach tightened. You're saying Adrian killed her? Caleb's eyes snapped up, fierce and sharp. I'm saying he dragged me into his nightmare. He made me carry things. He made me touch things. He made sure my DNA was on her. So if anything ever came out, I'd go down with him. Marcus felt the weight of that hit him like a blow. And now, Caleb said, his voice almost breaking, he's dead. He overdosed 3 years ago. And I'm the one left holding the crime. Marcus's grip tightened around the strap of his holster. Why didn't you come forward, Caleb? Why didn't you say this then? Because people don't believe teenage boys who say their perfect older brother is a murderer, Caleb spat out. Because my father told me to keep quiet. Because the cops didn't even look my way. Because everyone thought Adrian was a hero, and I was the screw-up. Marcus took another step closer. Caleb, put the evidence down. We can sort this out. If what you're saying is true, the DNA will tell us. No, it won't, Caleb said sharply. The DNA says it was me, and I can't prove otherwise. He made sure of that. Then let me help you. Caleb's jaw clenched. His hand hovered over the box. I'm not going to prison for something I didn't do. I won't. You won't, Marcus said calmly. But destroying the evidence only makes you look guilty. Caleb's eyes darted between Marcus, the door, and the box. Then he whispered, "It's too late." Before Marcus could react, Caleb grabbed the box, swung it back, and a gunshot exploded through the room. For a moment, the world froze. The box slipped from Caleb's hands, clattering onto the floor. Caleb himself staggered, shock washing over his face as he reached toward his shoulder, a dark stain blooming rapidly beneath his fingers. Marcus whipped around. At the door stood the same man who had attacked him earlier, Caleb's accomplice, holding a gun with both hands. His voice rang out through the room. "Caleb, we need to go, now!" Caleb stumbled back against the shelving, breath heaving. Marcus moved instantly, diving behind a metal table as the second man fired again, bullets cracking into steel and sending sparks flying. The evidence room erupted into chaos, gunfire, shouting, footsteps scrambling. Marcus shouted, "Caleb, don't run!" Parentheses. but Caleb was already pushing himself toward the rear exit, blood trailing behind him, determination and fear burning equally in his eyes. His accomplice covered the retreat with 2 more shots, forcing Marcus to stay down. Then, just as quickly as they had entered, they were gone. The side door slammed. Silence returned, heavy, suffocating, punctuated only by Marcus's ragged breaths and the faint drip of blood on the polished floor. Julia Markham's evidence box lay overturned, its contents spilled across the ground. And Caleb Vale, wounded, desperate, and more dangerous than ever, was now on the run. Marcus pushed himself up from behind the metal table, muscles screaming in protest, his vision still sharp with adrenaline. The evidence room was a mess. Boxes scattered, papers torn, blood darkening the floor. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain from the impact earlier. He didn't have time to tend to it now. Caleb was out there. His accomplice was out there. And every second they remained free increased the risk that vital evidence, proof of Julia Markham's murder, could be destroyed forever. Marcus scanned the room, his eyes falling on the evidence box. It had taken a hit, but was mostly intact. He grabbed it carefully, lifting it and checking the papers inside. Nothing appeared missing. Julia's case files, photographs, the original samples, everything was there, for now. That small relief barely registered. He knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Caleb wouldn't stop until he felt the threat removed. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed dispatch. "This is Detective Hall. I need units to lock down the Eastbrook Security Storage Facility immediately. Shots fired. Suspects possibly armed and dangerous. 1 male injured. 2 subjects in total. Over." "Copy that, Detective," the dispatcher replied. "Units are en route." Marcus took a deep breath and moved toward the rear exit. If Caleb had fled through the side door, Marcus needed to trace his path immediately. Every second counted. He glanced at the security monitor screens again. The footage showed Caleb and his accomplice sprinting down the loading dock ramp, Caleb clutching his side. The other man fired one last warning shot, and they disappeared into the alley behind the building. Marcus cursed under his breath. He ran back to his car, slamming the door as he started the engine. The street lights barely illuminated the alley ahead, but he didn't need clarity. He had instinct and determination. As he turned into the alley, he noticed a trail of blood along the pavement. Caleb's injury wasn't fatal, but it would leave a mark. Marcus's jaw tightened. He followed the trail, careful to keep cover, scanning for anyone waiting in ambush. The city seemed eerily silent, almost as if it too was holding its breath. 20 minutes later, Marcus reached the end of the alley near an abandoned warehouse. The blood trail stopped abruptly. He crouched behind a dumpster, listening. The sound of shallow, uneven breathing carried from somewhere inside. Caleb was here. Marcus drew his gun, moving silently toward the source. Each step was calculated, methodical. The warehouse doors were slightly ajar. He peered inside. The shadows were deep, stretching across crates and stacks of forgotten supplies. And there, on the floor, crouched against a stack of wooden pallets, was Caleb. Blood matted his hair, staining his clothes. His face was pale, eyes wide, but there was defiance in them. Marcus called out, keeping his tone firm but controlled. "Caleb Vale, it's over. Put your hands where I can see them." Caleb flinched, but didn't move immediately. Then, slowly, he raised one trembling hand. "It's not over," he whispered. "They'll never believe me." Marcus stepped closer, his weapons still trained on Caleb. Then tell me the truth, right now. Help me make them believe. Caleb swallowed hard. I didn't kill her, not directly. It was Adrian. He did everything. I was just trapped, forced to cover it up, forced to leave traces. I tried to stop him. I tried to hide it. Marcus felt the weight of every word. Years of cold cases, false leads, suspicions, all of it culminating in this moment. He lowered his weapon slightly. And your accomplice, who is he? Why was he helping you tonight? Caleb shook his head weakly. He's just another tool Adrian left behind. A guy Adrian had manipulated. I don't know him personally, but he wanted money, power. Whatever Adrian promised him decades ago, it's still in effect. They were supposed to help me destroy everything that tied us to that night. Marcus processed the confession. He spoke slowly, deliberately. You're going to the hospital first. Then you're going to tell the DA everything. Julia Markham's murder will finally be closed, and the truth about Adrian will come out. You understand me? Caleb nodded weakly. I understand, but I'm scared they'll never believe me. Marcus exhaled, tightening his grip on Caleb's arm to guide him toward the car. Then we'll make them believe. DNA spoke, Caleb. Now you have to. And I'm not letting you run or hide. Not again. The wind cut through the alley as Marcus lifted Caleb into the back of his vehicle, bloodied but alive. Somewhere deep inside, he felt a grim satisfaction. The case that had haunted him for decades was finally unraveling, and the victim's story would finally be told. But one thing Marcus knew with absolute certainty: this night was far from over. Caleb's confession was only the beginning. The shadows of the past, Adrian Vale, his manipulations, the accomplices still lingered, and Marcus was determined to chase every one of them down, piece by piece, until the final truth was laid bare. Because some crimes, buried in time, refuse to stay silent, and some detectives refuse to let them. The drive to the hospital was tense and silent, punctuated only by Caleb's uneven breathing and the occasional rattle of the car as Marcus navigated the narrow streets. The blood on Caleb's shirt was drying rapidly in the cool night air, and Marcus knew every minute counted, not just to save him physically, but to ensure he stayed alive long enough to give his statement. At the hospital, Marcus carried Caleb into the emergency room, speaking urgently with the triage nurse. Gunshot wound, midsection, conscious but weak. Needs immediate stabilization. He's a key witness and a suspect in a decades-old homicide case. This is urgent. The nurse nodded, and within moments, Caleb was whisked away into surgery. Marcus waited outside, pacing the sterile hallway, replaying Caleb's words over and over in his mind. Adrian Vale had killed Julia Markham. Caleb had been coerced into covering it up. DNA had finally exposed the connection, and now the last link, the truth, was within reach. Hours passed. Marcus remained in the hospital, alternately scrolling through the original case files, checking surveillance footage, and mapping out the Vale family's history. Adrian Vale had been a seemingly perfect citizen, the kind of person everyone trusted. But Caleb's confession suggested a darkness hidden behind the mask. Finally, a doctor emerged. Detectives Hall? Marcus approached quickly. How is he? Stable, the doctor said. We managed to control the bleeding. He'll need observation, but he's conscious and able to speak. Relief washed over Marcus, though it was tempered by the knowledge that Caleb's cooperation would still be a delicate process. Marcus moved into the ICU waiting room, taking a deep breath before entering Caleb's room. Caleb lay on the hospital bed, pale but alert, eyes tracking Marcus as he approached. "You're alive," Marcus said quietly. Caleb gave a faint, almost ironic smile. "Barely. Feels like 30 years of running caught up to me all at once." Marcus pulled up a chair. "Caleb, I need the full story. Every detail about that night, Adrian, the cover-up, everything." Caleb exhaled slowly. "It's all true, Detective. I didn't kill her. I didn't even touch her in the way they think I did. But Adrian, his voice faltered. He lost control. He planned it. I tried to stop him, but he was stronger, angrier, and I was just a kid. He made sure I would take the fall if anything ever came out." Marcus nodded. "Start from the beginning." Caleb's confession unfolded over the next several hours, each word precise and laced with guilt and fear. Adrian had manipulated him, isolated him, and turned him into a participant by intimidation and fear. Caleb had watched, been forced to move evidence, been present at moments that would incriminate him, and lived under the shadow of his brother's control for years. "And the accomplice tonight?" Marcus asked. "That's one of Adrian's old associates," Caleb admitted. "Someone he convinced decades ago that helping cover the crime would benefit them. I didn't even know he was still around until tonight. He thought he was helping me protect myself." By the time Caleb finished, the room was thick with the weight of decades-old secrets finally spoken aloud. Marcus listened without interruption, knowing every detail mattered. The puzzle was finally complete. DNA had led them here, but Caleb's voice would cement the story in court. Marcus leaned back, exhausted but resolute. "You're safe now, Caleb, and the town will finally know the truth about Julia Markham and Adrian Vale." Eyes wary but hopeful. "Will they believe me?" "They will," Marcus said firmly. "We have DNA, we have your confession, and we have everything else you've given us. This ends with the truth being told." Marcus called Chief Rourke and the district attorney. Within hours, a team of detectives was mobilized. Caleb, once a fugitive in the shadows of his own life, was now a key witness in bringing justice to a crime buried in time. By morning, the news spread quietly through the city. New developments in the Markham case. Decades-old secrets revealed. A killer unmasked. Marcus watched the sun rise over the skyline, the cold morning light washing over the streets. For the first time in years, a sense of closure began to take root, not just for him, but for the memory of Julia Markham and everyone whose life had been touched by this crime. And though Caleb would face his own reckoning for his role in covering the crime, the truth, the real truth, would finally be told. Marcus Hall stood on the hospital steps, breathing in the crisp morning air, reflecting on how a single strand of DNA had spoken louder than fear, lies, or decades of silence. Some crimes, no matter how deeply buried, refused to remain hidden. And some detectives, no matter how worn, refused to let them go. Justice, delayed though it may be, had finally found its voice. By the following week, Caleb Vale was stabilized and cooperating fully with the authorities. Marcus had secured all the evidence, from the DNA match to the original case files, to the statements Caleb had provided. Every piece fit together like a grim mosaic, each fragment painting the horrifying truth about Adrian Vale and the night Julia Markham died. The district attorney moved quickly. The court date was set for preliminary hearings, and news crews swarmed outside the courthouse. Marcus knew Caleb would be under intense scrutiny. Public opinion often turned against those who confessed to being involved, even peripherally, in heinous crimes. But Caleb's honesty and willingness to cooperate were crucial. Without it, the case against Adrian, long dead but still casting a shadow, would have remained buried. On the first day in court, Marcus took his seat near Caleb. The young man, older now, battle-weary and scarred, looked nervous but resolute. He'd been through decades of fear, running from a crime he didn't commit. Now, he was finally going to tell the truth openly, in front of a jury that had no preconceptions. The DA opened with a powerful statement, painting the narrative of Julia Markham's murder, the decades-long cover-up, and the breakthrough DNA evidence that had brought the case roaring back into the present. The jurors leaned in, captivated by the tale of a crime once forgotten, but now illuminated by modern forensic science. Marcus testified meticulously, walking the courtroom through the sequence of events as he had reconstructed them. The initial investigation, the original interviews with the Vale brothers, the pieces of evidence overlooked or misinterpreted, and finally, the DNA breakthrough. He kept his tone steady, professional, but the weight of decades of frustration and obsession leaked through every word. Then Caleb took the stand. His testimony was chilling. He described his brother Adrian's violent tendencies, the coercion, the manipulation, and the moments he had been forced to cover up evidence. He described his own fear, his desperation, and his eventual flight from the law when he realized the scope of what Adrian had orchestrated. Every detail was precise, personal, and raw. Some jurors gasped. Others sat frozen, absorbed in the story of a family torn apart by secrecy and violence. Marcus watched Caleb carefully, noting the moments he hesitated, the subtle flinch when recalling the most brutal memories, and the courage it took for him to keep speaking. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. "DNA finally cracks decades-old murder case," read one headline. "Adrian Vale's dark legacy revealed," read another. Social media buzzed with debates, disbelief, and fascination. The story gripped the public imagination. A murder thought unsolvable for nearly 30 years, now exposed by science, courage, and persistence. Marcus knew the trial wasn't over. Civil suits, appeals, and public scrutiny would follow. But the core truth was finally clear. Julia Markham's name would no longer be forgotten. Her life, tragically cut short, had finally been acknowledged, and her killer's shadow over the Vale family exposed in full. And for Marcus, there was a personal victory too. He had pursued justice relentlessly, long past the point when most would have given up. The DNA that had once been just a microscopic clue had spoken louder than anyone could have imagined, bridging decades of silence and deception. As the courtroom proceedings continued, Caleb's voice grew steadier. Each statement was a piece of liberation, each confession a step toward closure, not just for the victim, but for the investigator who had refused to let the case die quietly in the shadows. Outside, the morning sun broke fully over the city, reflecting off the courthouse windows. Marcus felt a rare moment of calm. The storm of 30 years of frustration, grief, and unanswered questions had finally begun to settle. Justice, delayed though it had been, had arrived. Not neat, not painless, but undeniable. And as the DA concluded the opening session, Marcus allowed himself a brief exhale. The truth had been unearthed, and nothing, not time, not fear, not lies, could bury it again. The courtroom grew tense as the trial progressed. Witnesses were called, Neighbors, colleagues, old friends, anyone who could shed light on Adrian Vale's character and actions. Each testimony, carefully corroborated with forensic evidence and Caleb's detailed account, built an undeniable picture of manipulation, coercion, and ultimately, murder. Marcus watched from the side, eyes scanning the jury, noting their reactions. Some shifted uncomfortably as witness after witness described Adrian's volatile temper. Others scribbled notes feverishly, trying to reconcile the outwardly perfect life Adrian had led with the horrific acts Caleb revealed. The prosecutor called expert witnesses next: DNA analysts, crime scene investigators, and psychologists. They explained the science in clear terms, showing how Caleb's DNA had been present not because of guilt, but because he had been coerced to touch evidence. The jury could see the distinction, understand the manipulation, and begin to separate truth from decades of fear and secrecy. Finally, it was Caleb's turn again. He stepped onto the stand, steadier now, the weight of years of silence giving way to the power of finally being heard. "I want the truth to be known," he said, voice firm but tinged with emotion. "I was trapped, scared, and I made mistakes. But I didn't kill Julia Markham. Adrian Vale did. I was only trying to survive, and now I want justice for her." The courtroom was silent. Marcus felt a surge of relief and pride. This was the moment the DNA had built toward. The moment decades of painstaking investigation, painstaking patience, finally converged in clarity. Cross-examination was brutal, but Caleb held steady. He faced every question, every accusation, and every insinuation with honesty. He admitted his past mistakes, the fear that had controlled him, and the moments he had been forced to act against his conscience. But he did not waver in telling the jury the truth. Adrian Vale was the murderer, and Caleb's role had been coerced, manipulated, and tragic. As the trial moved toward the closing arguments, Marcus listened to the prosecutor summarize the evidence. Every strand of DNA, every witness statement, every document was presented as a mosaic that proved one undeniable fact. Adrian Vale had committed murder, and Caleb Vale had been an unwilling participant, forced into complicity by fear and manipulation. The defense attempted to discredit Caleb, painting him as unreliable, unstable, and self-serving. But the combination of DNA evidence, corroborating witnesses, and Marcus's meticulous reconstruction of the past left little room for doubt. By the time the closing arguments concluded, the jury had seen the full picture. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was finally delivered. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson spoke. In the matter of the state versus Adrian Vale, we find that the evidence confirms that Adrian Vale is deceased, but we find the defendant, Caleb Vale, guilty only of accessory to obstruction of justice under duress, and not guilty of murder. A collective exhale filled the room. Caleb sagged in relief, tears streaming down his face. Marcus approached, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "The truth is finally out." Caleb nodded, voice breaking. "Julia, justice, it's finally hers." Outside, reporters swarmed, eager for a statement. Marcus spoke carefully, ensuring the narrative stayed focused on the victim and the decades of investigative persistence. This case shows that truth can be delayed, but not denied. DNA gave us a voice we didn't have 30 years ago, and the story of Julia Markham, finally, can be told in full. For Marcus, there was a sense of closure, but he also knew the impact stretched beyond him. Families, colleagues, and a town long haunted by a faceless crime could finally begin to heal. The shadows of Adrian Vale's manipulation and the fear he had instilled in his brother had been lifted. Caleb, scarred but alive, could finally start rebuilding a life beyond fear and secrecy. As Marcus left the courthouse that day, the sun high in the sky, he reflected on the power of patience, persistence, and science. Some crimes are buried in time, hidden by lies, fear, and silence. But truth has a way of resurfacing, speaking louder than deceit, and illuminating even the darkest corners. Julia Markham's story had finally been told, and Marcus Hall, detective, relentless pursuer of justice, knew that as long as the truth existed, no crime, no matter how deeply buried, could remain in the shadows forever. Weeks after the trial, Eastbrook began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Though the shadow of Julia Markham's case lingered in conversations, headlines, and quiet reflections, the town had been forced to confront a dark truth, one that had been buried for decades under fear, lies, and silence. But thanks to Marcus Hall and the breakthrough of DNA evidence, that darkness was finally exposed. Caleb Vale, now free from the immediate weight of suspicion, and with his minor charges resolved, began the slow process of rebuilding his life. It wasn't easy. The scars ran deep, emotional, psychological, and social. Friends he had lost, relationships he had strained, and a past he had been forced to endure could not simply be erased. But for the first time in decades, Caleb could live without fear. He could speak openly about what happened, and he could finally separate himself from the legacy of his brother Adrian, a man whose life of control and manipulation had left a trail of devastation. Marcus stayed close during the initial weeks of Caleb's reintegration into society. He knew that even with the court's verdict, trust had to be rebuilt, and Caleb's steps toward redemption needed guidance and support. Together, they worked through files, revisited old evidence, and ensured that every fragment of the case had been properly documented. The finality wasn't just about the verdict. It was about cementing the story for history, so that Julia's life and Adrian's crimes could never be forgotten. In the city, the story captured the imagination of the public. Podcasts, news outlets, and social media discussions dissected the case, fascinated by the decades-long mystery, the forensic breakthrough, and the human drama entwined in the Vale family. DNA had spoken where fear and silence had failed. It had pierced through the veil of deception and forced the truth into the light. Marcus often visited Julia Markham's grave. Standing there in the quiet, he thought about the young woman whose life had been stolen too soon, whose memory had been suppressed by time and deceit. He placed a hand on the headstone. "Justice took a long time, Julia," he whispered. "But your story was never forgotten. We finally let the truth speak." Caleb eventually moved to a quieter town, away from the constant reminders of his family's past. He sought therapy, support groups, and ways to atone for the fear he had carried. Though he could never undo the past, he could ensure that truth, honesty, and integrity guided his future. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his work as a detective, carrying with him the lessons of the case. That one strand of DNA, a seemingly small clue, had unraveled decades of lies. That the smallest truth, when followed with patience and precision, could topple mountains of deception. and that some crimes, no matter how deeply buried, refuse to stay hidden forever. In the end, the Markham case became more than a story of murder. It became a story of resilience, persistence, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The town of Eastbrook could finally breathe, knowing that darkness had been confronted, and that even after decades, the truth could not be silenced. Marcus stood outside the courthouse one last time, reflecting. He knew there would always be more cases, more mysteries, more shadows to chase. But this case, buried in time until DNA spoke, would remain with him forever. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, to ensure that silence never triumphed over truth, and that no crime, no matter how long concealed, could escape the light. He walked away from the courthouse, the sun rising higher, casting long golden streaks across the city streets. Somewhere, far below the surface, justice had finally spoken, and Marcus Hall knew that as long as he drew breath, he would listen and follow wherever the truth led. The end. By the following week, Caleb Vale was stabilized and cooperating fully with the authorities. Marcus had secured all the evidence, from the DNA match to the original case files, to the statements Caleb had provided. Every piece fit together like a grim mosaic, each fragment painting the horrifying truth about Adrian Vale and the night Julia Markham died. The district attorney moved quickly. The court date was set for preliminary hearings, and news crews swarmed outside the courthouse. Marcus knew Caleb would be under intense scrutiny. Public opinion often turned against those who confessed to being involved, even peripherally, in heinous crimes. But Caleb's honesty and willingness to cooperate were crucial. Without it, the case against Adrian, long dead but still casting a shadow, would have remained buried. On the first day in court, Marcus took his seat near Caleb. The young man, older now, battle-weary and scarred, looked nervous but resolute. He'd been through decades of fear, running from a crime he didn't commit. Now, he was finally going to tell the truth openly, in front of a jury that had no preconceptions. The DA opened with a powerful statement, painting the narrative of Julia Markham's murder, the decades-long cover-up, and the breakthrough DNA evidence that had brought the case roaring back into the present. The jurors leaned in, captivated by the tale of a crime once forgotten, but now illuminated by modern forensic science. Marcus testified meticulously, walking the courtroom through the sequence of events as he had reconstructed them. The initial investigation, the original interviews with the Vale brothers, the pieces of evidence overlooked or misinterpreted, and finally, the DNA breakthrough. He kept his tone steady, professional, but the weight of decades of frustration and obsession leaped through every word. Then Caleb took the stand. His testimony was chilling. He described his brother Adrian's violent tendencies, the coercion, the manipulation, and the moments he had been forced to cover up evidence. He described his own fear, his desperation, and his eventual flight from the law when he realized the scope of what Adrian had orchestrated. Every detail was precise, personal, and raw. Some jurors gasped. Others sat frozen, absorbed in the story of a family torn apart by secrecy and violence. Marcus watched Caleb carefully, noting the moments he hesitated, the subtle flinch when recalling the most brutal memories, and the courage it took for him to keep speaking. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed. "DNA finally cracks decades-old murder case," read one headline. "Adrian Vale's dark legacy revealed," read another. Social media buzzed with debates, disbelief, and fascination. The story gripped the public imagination, a murder thought unsolvable for nearly 30 years, now exposed by science, courage, and persistence. Marcus knew the trial wasn't over. Civil suits, appeals, and public scrutiny would follow. But the core truth was finally clear. Julia Markham's name would no longer be forgotten. Her life, tragically cut short, had finally been acknowledged, and her killer's shadow over the Vale family exposed in full. And for Marcus, there was a personal victory too. He had pursued justice relentlessly, long past the point when most would have given up. The DNA that had once been just a microscopic clue had spoken louder than anyone could have imagined, bridging decades of silence and deception. As the courtroom proceedings continued, Caleb's voice grew steadier. Each statement was a piece of liberation, each confession a step toward closure, not just for the victim, but for the investigator who had refused to let the case die quietly in the shadows. Outside, the morning sun broke fully over the city, reflecting off the courthouse windows. Marcus felt a rare moment of calm. The storm of 30 years of frustration, grief, and unanswered questions had finally begun to settle. Justice, delayed though it had been, had arrived. Not neat, not painless, but undeniable. And as the DA concluded the opening session, Marcus allowed himself a brief exhale. The truth had been unearthed, and nothing, not time, not fear, not lies, could bury it again. The courtroom grew tense as the trial progressed. Witnesses were called. Neighbors, colleagues, old friends, anyone who could shed light on Adrian Vale's character and actions. Each testimony, carefully corroborated with forensic evidence and Caleb's detailed account, built an undeniable picture of manipulation, coercion, and ultimately, murder. Marcus watched from the side, eyes scanning the jury, noting their reactions. Some shifted uncomfortably as witness after witness described Adrian's volatile temper. Others scribbled notes feverishly, trying to reconcile the outwardly perfect life Adrian had led with the horrific acts Caleb revealed. The prosecutor called expert witnesses next: DNA analysts, crime scene investigators, and psychologists. They explained the science in clear terms, showing how Caleb's DNA had been present not because of guilt, but because he had been coerced to touch evidence. The jury could see the distinction, understand the manipulation, and begin to separate truth from decades of fear and secrecy. Finally, it was Caleb's turn again. He stepped onto the stand, steadier now, the weight of years of silence giving way to the power of finally being heard. "I want the truth to be known," he said, voice firm but tinged with emotion. "I was trapped, scared, and I made mistakes. But I didn't kill Julia Markham. Adrian Vale did. I was only trying to survive, and now I want justice for her." The courtroom was silent. Marcus felt a surge of relief and pride. This was the moment the DNA had built toward. The moment decades of painstaking investigation, painstaking patience, finally converged in clarity. Cross-examination was brutal, but Caleb held steady. He faced every question, every accusation, and every insinuation with honesty. He admitted his past mistakes, the fear that had controlled him, and the moments he had been forced to act against his conscience. But he did not waver in telling the jury the truth. Adrian Vale was the murderer, and Caleb's role had been coerced, manipulated, and tragic. As the trial moved toward the closing arguments, Marcus listened to the prosecutor summarize the evidence. Every strand of DNA, every witness statement, Every document was presented as a mosaic that proved one undeniable fact. Adrian Vale had committed murder, and Caleb Vale had been an unwilling participant, forced into complicity by fear and manipulation. The defense attempted to discredit Caleb, painting him as unreliable, unstable, and self-serving. But the combination of DNA evidence, corroborating witnesses, and Marcus's meticulous reconstruction of the past left little room for doubt. By the time the closing arguments concluded, the jury had seen the full picture. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was finally delivered. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson spoke. In the matter of the state versus Adrian Vale, we find that the evidence confirms that Adrian Vale is deceased, but we find the defendant, Caleb Vale, guilty only of accessory to obstruction of justice under duress, and not guilty of murder. A collective exhale filled the room. Caleb sagged in relief, tears streaming down his face. Marcus approached, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "The truth is finally out." Caleb nodded, voice breaking. "Julia, justice, it's finally hers." Outside, reporters swarmed, eager for a statement. Marcus spoke carefully, ensuring the narrative stayed focused on the victim and the decades of investigative persistence. This case shows that truth can be delayed, but not denied. DNA gave us a voice we didn't have 30 years ago, and the story of Julia Markham, finally, can be told in full. For Marcus, there was a sense of closure, but he also knew the impact stretched beyond him. Families, colleagues, and a town long haunted by a faceless crime could finally begin to heal. The shadows of Adrian Vale's manipulation and the fear he had instilled in his brother had been lifted. Caleb, scarred but alive, could finally start rebuilding a life beyond fear and secrecy. As Marcus left the courthouse that day, the sun high in the sky, he reflected on the power of patience, persistence, and science. Some crimes are buried in time, hidden by lies, fear, and silence. But truth has a way of resurfacing, speaking louder than deceit, and illuminating even the darkest corners. Julia Markham's story had finally been told, and Marcus Hall, detective, relentless pursuer of justice, knew that as long as the truth existed, no crime, no matter how deeply buried, could remain in the shadows forever. Weeks after the trial, Eastbrook began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Though the shadow of Julia Markham's case lingered in conversations, headlines, and quiet reflections, the town had been forced to confront a dark truth, one that had been buried for decades under fear, lies, and silence. But thanks to Marcus Hall and the breakthrough of DNA evidence, that darkness was finally exposed. Caleb Vale, now free from the immediate weight of suspicion, and with his minor charges resolved, began the slow process of rebuilding his life. It wasn't easy. The scars ran deep, emotional, psychological, and social. Friends he had lost, relationships he had strained, and a past he had been forced to endure could not simply be erased. But for the first time in decades, Caleb could live without fear. He could speak openly about what happened, and he could finally separate himself from the legacy of his brother Adrian, a man whose life of control and manipulation had left a trail of devastation. Marcus stayed close during the initial weeks of Caleb's reintegration into society. He knew that even with the court's verdict, trust had to be rebuilt, and Caleb's steps toward redemption needed guidance and support. Together, they worked through files, revisited old evidence, and ensured that every fragment of the case had been properly documented. The finality wasn't just about the verdict. It was about cementing the story for history, so that Julia's life and Adrian's crimes could never be forgotten. In the city, the story captured the imagination of the public. Podcasts, news outlets, and social media discussions dissected the case, fascinated by the decades-long mystery, the forensic breakthrough, and the human drama entwined in the Vale family. DNA had spoken where fear and silence had failed. It had pierced through the veil of deception and forced the truth into the light. Marcus often visited Julia Markham's grave. Standing there in the quiet, he thought about the young woman whose life had been stolen too soon, whose memory had been suppressed by time and deceit. He placed a hand on the headstone. "Justice took a long time, Julia," he whispered. "But your story was never forgotten. We finally let the truth speak." Caleb eventually moved to a quieter town, away from the constant reminders of his family's past. He sought therapy, support groups, and ways to atone for the fear he had carried. Though he could never undo the past, he could ensure that truth, honesty, and integrity guided his future. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his work as a detective, carrying with him the lessons of the case. That one strand of DNA, a seemingly small clue, had unraveled decades of lies. That the smallest truth, when followed with patience and precision, could topple mountains of deception. And that some crimes, no matter how deeply buried, refuse to stay hidden forever. In the end, the Markham case became more than a story of murder. It became a story of resilience, persistence, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The town of Eastbrook could finally breathe, knowing that darkness had been confronted, and that even after decades, the truth could not be silenced. Marcus stood outside the courthouse one last time, reflecting. He knew there would always be more cases, more mysteries, more shadows to chase. But this case, buried in time until DNA spoke, would remain with him forever. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, to ensure that silence never triumphed over truth, and that no crime, no matter how long concealed, could escape the light. He walked away from the courthouse, the sun rising higher, casting long golden streaks across the city streets. Somewhere, far below the surface, justice had finally spoken, and Marcus Hall knew that as long as he drew breath, he would listen and follow wherever the truth led. The end.